Alrighty, let's kick off. So my name is Sedky. I lead the solutions engineering teams here at Tyke, and I'm very excited to talk to our panelists because we've been seeing platform teams kick off as a trend about 6, 7 months ago. Well, longer than that, but really seeing it in my space in API management, and really excited to talk to our panelists here. So first of all, I have the pleasure of introducing Jennifer. Jennifer Riggins is a tech storyteller, journalist, writer, event, and podcast host. I don't know how she has time for all that, who focuses on the developer experience. You may know her for her work on the new stack and lead dev. Carol is a senior product manager at Tyke Technologies. She's leading the design and development of the Tyke ecosystem, platform, and the tooling that enable the platform teams around the world to build their platform strategies. So specifically right now, she's currently leading the API governance project that allow the enterprises to have the unified control of modern API ecosystems. And we're going to talk about all that. Finally, last but certainly not least, Abby Bangser. Abby's a principal engineer at Syntasso, delivering Kratix, an open source cloud native framework which helps people build better platforms. Abby comes to the space with over a decade of internal tooling experience across DevOps, SRE, and platform engineering roles. So with that said, we've seen a lot of overlap between these three terms. Abby, can you kick us off by telling us a little bit about DevOps, platform engineering, and SRE? Are these an evolution of the same thing? Is platform engineering a better DevOps? Is it replacing it? What does all that look like?
Yes, the evergreen question. I feel like this is it's interesting to talk about them because they're all roles, and I've actually held the title from all of them at some point in my career, despite the fact that what they really all embody is more philosophies that have been turned into roles, right? So I think that they're all kind of lenses on how to build and operate software, and they approach them from with different kind of criteria or priorities in mind. So when you look at something like DevOps, what you're talking about there is how do you enable a team to work independently, to give them full control over that development and operations process. Full stack is what is often spoken about there. When you're looking at something kind of maybe on the other end of the spectrum, like SRE, that is almost sort of like that throw it over the wall mentality, even if it's the modern version, where things have to meet a certain threshold, but then there are operators who can support that. And different people operate with SRE differently. There's the book, and then there's organizational, implementations. And then you look at platform engineering, which I think is sort of a balancing in there. What it's doing, in my opinion, is it's taking DevOps and it's trying to make that more sustainable at scale. So if DevOps is about enabling a team to be fully autonomous, to be able to build and run the things that they need to, the value they're providing, then what we're doing with platform engineering is we're shortening the stack that they have to build and run. We're shortening the stack of what they focus on to deliver value for. So instead of having to think all the way down to maybe networking, they're starting from existing networks, existing compute, existing data storage, and they're worrying about the part of their application that they are kind of getting the most value for the business from, while the people who are providing that compute and networking and so on, the platform teams usually, are also employing DevOps as a methodology to build and run the services that those other teams depend on. So yeah, they all sort of have lenses on a similar build and run problem space.
Makes sense. Would you expect companies to eventually have just the platform engineering teams in place and basically absorb DevOps and SRE into the same function? Or is there a role today for all three to continue to exist independently? What's the relationships there? And Jennifer and Carol would feel free to jump in as well at any point.
Well, yeah,
I can go for it, Jennifer. Yeah,
just Jennifer can use my full name.
It's weird.
No, it's just we're seeing at most companies there is a platform team and an SRE team, and that's kind of at larger companies, of course, or enterprises, but that's kind of helping fulfill, not fully, this promise of DevOps, I would say. But I don't know that maybe the titles may change and there may not be a quote DevOps team, but DevOps is still an ongoing, I hate the word transformation because it sounds like there's an end, but it's an ongoing process where it's happening. But platform engineering and SRE can help facilitate that in a safe way. What do you think?
Yeah, I think this is more really evolutions of things where we transform from one name to another, but the goal, the essence of things that we're trying to do is the same, but just using different perspectives, different methodologies to achieve this thing. I think maybe in 2 years' time we have another operating models or methodologies to do this even better. It's a journey of evolvement, like over these things.
I think that
Makes sense.
evolution is the key thing. Where we start to get into trouble is that we think of them as just new terms in some places when we can't tease out the nuance of the value. And I think each of these I can definitely look at and I can say they bring an extra spice and extra value to the way that you look at things. But I can also look at them and say, poor Lou, I quote him all the time, ops in a trench coat, right? When you don't tease out what those values are for each of them. DevOps about autonomy, platform engineering about shortening the stack, and SRE around that operating model in production. Like those are the nuances that you really have to go for. Otherwise, they do feel like just renames, which is always frustrating.
Which did happen. There are people that got renamed DevOps engineers to platform engineers, which
without the change.
Engineers get paid more. So
there's some change
for you as an individual, but not for the organization.
I want to, Jennifer, let's move it on specific to what the platform teams are charged with, why we're all here today, which is talk about improving the development lifecycle. So I want to focus on developer autonomy piece. What, in your perspective, are the risks of too much developer autonomy in specifically in API design, and how do we mitigate them? In other words, what is the value prop for platform teams in making this process of designing APIs? You heard, for those of you that saw Ken's awesome talk about OAS as an example, and you know, you can break that down into a lot of different buckets, and he did. But I want to get Jennifer's take specifically on the platform team's job in developer autonomy piece for API design.
Well, APIs are everything, so the principles apply, whether it's APIs or other microservices. Those are pretty much the two biggest things that developers are touching. But we started over here in 20, 30 years ago, where it was really restrictive. You did have a platform, but that was to control developers. And then we moved over as, well, you've seen the cloud. Well, no one's seen the whole screen of the cloud native computing foundations landscape because it doesn't fit on any screen now. So we had this explosion of tools, and developers had a sort of autonomy, plus sometimes tools are really cheap to start, plus open source. So they were allowed to, it was free. Anyway, it's not free, you still have to maintain all of that. But then they had this whole tool sprawl. So we had this massive API sprawl, which led to financial cost and this cognitive load where a majority of developers are spending up to an hour a day looking for stuff. Nobody has an idea. So at a different webinar I attended with Ken Lane like a month ago, they wrote about basically people don't know. They think they have like 10% of APIs are public facing. They've designed them for public, but most APIs are actually public facing. So you don't know what data is going in or out and why things were even created, who owns what does what. That means you have this loss of reusability, especially when creating APIs is not, as Abby always talks about, your differential. It's important. It's not unimportant, but it's not differential. There's also no consistencies around error codes, which for internal and external users, you don't have standards in enforceability. What Sophie said at the beginning, like if you have better API governance, it can be your competitive advantage. But then when you have golden paths and easier to follow standards, which platforms allow that. So the best way, like one of the prevailing patterns for success with a platform is to allow developers to build on top of it with APIs. So in no way are we saying that developer autonomy is wrong because we distrust developers. And I think that's super important right now. We in the room, I mean, there are companies saying that, but And there are companies, literally, there is a financial cost to tool sprawl. And I'd rather you slim down your tools than slim down your responsibility to your hired staff. And I do think we have the responsibility. But by getting rid of these mundane, repeatable, what is it, the rule of three? If you have to do something 3 times, you should automate it. You be reusable in creating those APIs, having a database, knowing who does what. Then we bring the AI, which we'll talk about later probably, but like you have a searchable interface over it, you have discoverability that enables developers to focus on the creative problem solving and the differentials.
Wow, thank you, Jennifer. So Jennifer's explained to us all, all the different pain points associated and why governance and API management as a philosophy and in practice are solutions to all of that. I want to go to Abby for the flip side. Abby, what is the balance for implementing API governance without stifling developer creativity and agility?
Yeah, I think that the key here is to understand what does enable creativity and agility, and what is governance that people actually don't want to have to think about, and therefore having that applied for them or set up for them is what they want and need. I know I noticed in the chat somebody mentioned around giving autonomy through guardrails, and I think that's a really important part of what gets talked about a lot with platform engineering, in that platforms should be optional. Optional enables you to understand if you're meeting your customer needs, and also allows people to go and find their needs met elsewhere if need be. The number one thing I don't hear people talking about, but I think is a mandatory part of optional, is making sure that there's clear expectations that can be checked against, and ideally automatedly checked against. If you have expectations around security for your APIs, around like RBAC and access controls, and all these kinds of things, or standardization around field names and things like that, and if people go off platform, they're still expected to meet those standards, but they have no way of validating against those standards. Like, how optional is the platform really? So I think the key here is just making sure you only validate and govern the things you have to, but when you do have to, make it really easy for people to get it for free. And so it's basically, they say, make the right thing the easy thing. And I think that's what governance really should be pushing towards.
Okay, and in a second, I'll go to Carol to talk about automations versus manual. But first, and there's a few different, for Hazel and Robert. An optional platform seems also a little bit of an illusion. Mandatory part of optional, as the takeaway quote here. That's great.
Thanks, Hazel. Thanks for the call out. No, but I think the reason why optional feels like an illusion is because it is in most organizations, because there are a set of requirements that you can't get around, right? Like, all of us as citizens of the countries that we live in and the cities that we live in have laws that we have as mandatory expectations, right? Just like being in an organization, you have certain mandatory expectations, and those can be quite dense if you're working for a highly regulated organization, right? Like, and that's not even within that organization's choice. It's in their domain. And that's what makes it feel very mandatory. But again, I think what actually can create some level of flexibility is when the things that are mandatory, the things that they don't have a choice on because of regulation, because of expectation at the org or domain or world level, are made clear and made kind of as prevalent as air. They just happen for you. You don't have to think about them. So that then all of a sudden the things that you are thinking about are the ones that do have a little bit of flexibility, do have a little bit of creativity. But I don't think people tease those apart enough. And so it ends up being like, this one thing meets our expectations and some stuff, but meets our expectations, so you have to use it, rather than making clear what in there is the mandatory bit.
Thank you. So yeah, I couldn't agree more. Mickey has a comment here that I want to read out because it's exact. So using an open API design first approach can manage and govern the public APIs. I couldn't agree more. It's a negotiation at the end of the day between the developers and the platform teams. If the developers are finding we're having to do too much customization or too little customization, it's a negotiation, and it allows you to iterate on what the governance and the guardrails look like. So it's not static ever at any one point. Carol, over to you. I want to ask you, so should API governance be enforced through policies and approvals, or embedded into developer workflows through automation and tooling? Now, I know most of us on the call here come from a development background, and we hate the idea of a request flow. We hate the idea of anything that's not automatic, right? It's submit up here and see a bunch of, but you know, is there a place for one or the other, or totally not unacceptable in the world of platform engineers? What's your take on it?
I agree 100% with Abby, like that automated checks is so important within the developer workflows. Like as a developer, I want to ship my code quickly. I want to remove all the blockers. So all these automated checks actually helps to build transparency and also confidence for myself to when I ship my code, because I can 100% ensure that I have built my code right. I'm compliant with all of the important security and compliance regulations out there. I might have do manual checklist or code reviews, but that wouldn't scale. This model doesn't scale. And think about the amount of APIs we have to operate every day. So I think the automations and toolings here really make sense. It's so much better if I, like as an API developer, I could get immediate feedback right in my IDE for when I'm writing my API service, when I'm configuring my API on my API management platform. So I can correct my mistakes before deploying my API. And also I think it serves as a very important educational loop back to myself and back to any new developers in your organizations, because they, through these trial and errors and feedback, they learned what the policy really is without needing to read your policy documentations, which I don't think anyone wants to read it every day. Yeah, so I think the automated checks here is really important, and platform engineering team is the perfect middleman here to help set up these golden paths, automated checks and toolings for enforcing your policy rules and building the guardrails, the non-optional of your rules, making sure everyone is aligned of the core non-breakable rules in your system.
And this just serves to close that feedback loop, which is one of the measurements of developer experience that's most important. That if developers are waiting around, it breaks their cognitive flow, it breaks their workflow, and they don't get it. So it closes that feedback loop quicker, which is helps them be successful and importantly feel successful at their jobs and find things quicker because they know what went wrong, not a week later.
And I think maybe at the central platform, you can have more effective monitoring and also reporting on your compliance status too. That again serve the feedback loop back to your policy enforcer, the one who's setting up all those policies, because policies should evolve over time too, based on team's need, the regulatory requirements change. So at that side, they can adapt to the changing needs according to the measurable data that we can collect from the platform.
There's so much to dive into. It's a shame we only have 10 more minutes because we could unpack each of these. Abby, I want to move on to you. How do organizations choose the right API governance model? You know, we've heard, again, more overloaded terms. I think it's an industry problem. Centralized governance models, distributed, federated. What do these all mean in practice, and which one would you suggest to companies? I know it's a loaded question. Which one would you? Sometimes they don't really get to decide. They find themselves in one, but would love to hear your thoughts about this.
Yeah, I think that this is where you start to get the uniqueness to an organization. So like APIs, as Jennifer was saying, everyone does them, everyone uses them, they're not unique. But how you want to manage those APIs and what value you get from the management of them can start to become what the special sauce your organization has decided on. And I think things such as the size of the organization or the level of regulation can have really big factors in these decisions. So a small organization can absorb a lot more kind of rework across teams, because there's only so many teams doing the rework. This is where the DevOps model really thrives, right? Because every team is able to do what they need to do. They feel unblocked and autonomous. They feel excited about their work. Yes, there is some duplication of effort, but that's okay at that scale. When you get into larger, now that's going to become an issue. Similarly with regulation, in lower regulation environments, the ability to have control over something that, patching a security concern, or being able to change to meet a new government regulation around personal data or things like that, becomes maybe less urgent because you don't have the regulations for you. You're not dealing with children's data. You're not dealing with personally identifiable data, things like that. But as soon as you have these regulations coming and hitting you, like GDPR hitting the EU and things like that, if you don't have the ability to track where this stuff is happening, to enforce changes to meet these new regulations, and to do so from a position of central access to that, you're going to have a really tough time rolling these things out. So I know centralized is the devil, and part of the reason is because it often encompasses a feeling of being blocked by a single central force. But I think what we want to talk about is what is the level of kind of control and access and ability to manage these things over time and at scale that you need. And sometimes that means centralized. And if it does mean centralized, what you need to be investing in is how you can do centralized without blocking people. And that's where you really are going to be, in my opinion, needing to put your energies and focus.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think also as companies mature or scale, as they find themselves usually moving to a federated model, and it's not always on purpose. It's you start to see large differences between what teams need. Of course, they're still going to be serviced by a centralized platform team, but on top of that foundation, this team might have different guardrails than the other team, which all are built on top of. So, Carol, let's take a practical example that we see in API management specifically at Tyke. So, companies who suddenly find themselves managing multiple API gateway vendors, how can they manage that situation?
Well, I think the first question to ask is why there are multiple API gateway exist in the organizations. Like, is it a result of organic growth, because of integrations needs, acquisitions, or is it a really deliberate choice there? And I think practically we should start by gathering the data, build up an inventory of all the API gateways that you're using and what APIs are running on each of those gateways, and then judge from there, is there any unique use case for each of the gateways? There might be opportunity to consolidate all these into a single platform, or you will find that there are really real needs for that to let you adopt a mixed approach there, which would more make sense for you. But for me, might be the simpler versions to simplify operations and also to reduce cost makes more sense in most of the case. So yeah, I think visualization is key here, to help us to make the decisions. To if we have a more federated API repositories build, it can help you to understand, to discover all the APIs running on all those different platforms, helps you to understand each gateway's strength and weakness, the security enhancements or integration that it can bring to organizations, and helps you to make a decision from there. And also maybe a universal governance tool that helps you to set and track the compliance status across all the platform would be really useful there, because as of today, like from LinkedIn, Kinley's keynotes, there is so much difference across the API management landscape. It's very complex and fragmented. There are no common standards or language that you can use to define rules on your APIs across the security standards, middleware's observability, performance or documentations. There's no such things for you to easily do that. So I think it would become a great burden for your platform engineering team to transcend your organization high-level requirements into those vendor-specific configuration and specifications. Yeah, so I think a centralized management layer on top of that would make sense to help you abstract all those complexities and let you focus on your organization high-level needs without the complexity of managing all those different platforms underneath.
Okay. Do you know any centralized management API management tools that can do federated gateways, Carol?
I'm building one.
Oh, weird. Tyke. Okay. Just wanted to put that on the record. Great. So we have time for one more question. Jennifer, I want to take this back to you. How, and this is going to be way left field. And before I move on, actually, I want to just one quick note. Kin Lane said something in the chat here that I want to say to the viewers watching the recording who don't have the privilege of having the chat. A lot of what we're describing is a people problem. It's not a technology problem. Like rate limiting is a technology problem, but governance, federation, and sprawl, these are people problems. So that was a light bulb moment for me. Thank you for putting it in such simple terms, Ken. So Jennifer, back to you. So let's finish with a hot topic. How is AI, LLMs, however you read AIs, how is AI influencing the roadmap and working models of platform engineering teams?
Well, I asked permission and she said I could. I wanted to quote Hazel Weekly had said in the comments. She said, "The way I often talk about this is about psychological safety. If my users can't freely speak out and tell me what their experience is with vulnerability, I can't solve those very real problems." Well, guess what? All the reports, whether you're talking Dora or everything in between, has organizations not asking developers or not listening. Maybe I do believe there are a lot of like platform teams asking these questions, but then of how they need generative AI or what problems they're trying to solve. So everybody's spending buttloads of money, and buttloads is billions,
Scientifically calculated.
on tools, which aren't great, especially for junior developers. They're not great. It's not what AI is great at. And yet that's the thing that any study you see, like Microsoft has a study of when are developers happiest, when do they feel most productive, is when they're writing code. But percentages may vary between 15 and 30%. I've never seen, usually 20% is average, I would say, of how much time developers spend writing code. Developers want you to spend more time writing code. So why are we trying to automate the one thing that is bad? And 50% of all code generated by AI has a bug in it. So maybe we're not listening, because Ken and I have been talking about this, and Lorna and James, a bunch of people on this call for 15 years now in the API space. The number one thing developers are complaining about, can anyone guess in the chat real quick? No one was fast enough to say documentation. And the last 10 years, it's also technical debt. These are the things they've self-identified. Guess what? These are things that are proven AI is good at. Like, AI is very good about explaining complex topics and understanding complex things like old ass code bases that nobody knows who owns what. It's very helpful with API discovery. It helps with creating documentation that is searchable in a natural language way that creates this conversation, because when we say people, as Kin said, it's not, these are people problems, yeah, but it's also a communication problem. It's that famous chasm between the business and the technology. And that's where platform engineering's come in, because not only are there these layoffs, but reasonably you can say the engineering department's probably the most expensive department between your staff and your cloud bill. So look at ways to reduce your cloud bill first, again, please. But you should, like, business reasonably needs a better insight into what's going on. So that's really interesting. Another thing that's come out of the API community is this idea of specification-driven development or behavior-driven development to keep things within boundaries. Because right now, less than half of organizations have an AI policy, which to me is wild 3 years into this, of this heavy Like, even if your AI policies, please do not put customer and human resource information into the tool. Please do not put our proprietary code into the tool. Please do not use code that you're not sure if was trained on proprietary code and we're going to get fined because we use someone else's code that's in the API, in the base. These should be logical things. Yet more than half of organizations still don't have them, of all sizes. And I don't think banning it's going to work because we have all the shadow AI, which is the next level of shadow IT. Guy Pajarni, I will share in the chat. I wrote an article last week about what is a native AI developer, but really development team. But he gave a really great talk at State of OpenCon 2 weeks ago and explaining this idea of spec-driven development, which is where you use plain language to describe new functions. It's very behavioral-driven development. You develop code based on those specifications, and then you test all code against that spec. That is an API best practice that needs to happen in this generative AI space. So we stop being so code-centric, because code's not a great source of truth because we don't have good documentation, we don't have the why, and we don't have good testing to test against any standards. So instead, if you use specification-driven development in this generative AI, especially, but all code generated, ideally, by humans as well, because we should still be generating code. Not me, obviously, but all y'all. A lot of the best practices that are often ignored in AI and API governance can be then applied to not only API governance, but AI governance. So it creates improved consistency, earlier validation about what's being built should be built, and then it creates that language that API, y'all are not great at speaking to business. I'm going to call it out. It's just something that, like, notoriously over the last 15 years I've been doing this is truth. So we need to create this collaboration and communication with the business stakeholders in natural language, but also because then maybe we'll start applying generative AI at where it's both good at and is actually solving developer problems. And APIs are completely involved in all of that. So there's
awesome. Thank you, Jennifer. I think you definitely struck a chord with a lot of people based on the chat here. Everybody, make sure you pay attention to the closing keynote, because there's a really special announcement on AI governance. So make sure you say that. Thanks for the reminder, Damien. Abby, Jennifer, Carol, thank you so much for joining us today. Really looking forward to doing this again. Thank you to all the attendees for being really fun in the chat, I guess is the best way to put it. So thanks everybody, and we'll see you at the next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Bye.